She stepped off the wagon with a flour sack over one shoulder and dirt on her boots, and the first thing Caleb Holt said when he laid eyes on her was loud enough for every man in that saloon to hear. "That ain't what I asked for." The whole room laughed. Abigail Mercer didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked straight at the man who'd just humiliated her in front of 30 strangers and said, "Show me your kitchen." Nobody in Black Hollow knew it yet, but the most dangerous person who had ever walked into that town had just arrived, and she was carrying a flour sack. Click like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. Stay tuned to the end, because this woman will change everything. The stagecoach pulled into Black Hollow on a Tuesday, which was the worst possible day for anything to happen in that town, because Tuesday was when men had already spent Monday's whiskey and hadn't yet found reason to drink Wednesdays. The main street was wide and sun-beaten and mostly empty. A dog slept in the middle of the road. 2 old men sat outside the general store doing nothing in particular, and both of them watched the stagecoach roll in with the same expression, the dull, half-curious look of people who had stopped expecting anything interesting to arrive. Abigail Mercer was the only passenger. She stepped down from that coach before the driver even had a chance to set the step properly, and she landed in the dust with both boots flat, the way someone steps off who has no patience for ceremony. She had a flour sack tied at the top and slung over one shoulder. She had a small wooden box tucked under her other arm, the kind that latched with a brass clasp and had seen better years. Her dress was brown and practical and clean, though the hem had picked up road dust from somewhere around Laramie. Her hair was dark and pulled back tightly enough that it told you something about how she moved through the world. No loose ends, no wasted effort. She was 31 years old. She looked like she had worked hard for every single one of those years. She stood there in the street and looked up at the faded sign above the nearest building. Holt Saloon and Boarding. The paint was peeling at the H, and the O had been repainted badly by someone who wasn't sure what an O was supposed to look like. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took to understand what it told her, and then she walked toward it. The saloon was dim inside, which was one of its better qualities. The floorboards had warped near the entrance where rain had gotten under the door, and nobody had done anything about it for what looked like 2 or 3 seasons. There were 6 tables. 2 were missing chairs. The bar ran along the left wall with a mirror behind it that had a crack running from the bottom right corner up toward the middle, splitting every reflection into 2 pieces that didn't quite match. 4 men were drinking. 2 were playing cards with the concentrated silence of men who weren't actually thinking about cards. 1 man was asleep face down at a table near the window, and nobody seemed concerned about him. Behind the bar stood a man who Abigail figured, correctly, was Caleb Holt. He was tall in the way that suggests it had once been an advantage and had since become something he just carried around. His shoulders were wide and his hands were big, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been assembled by someone who took the work seriously. He was somewhere between 35 and 40, though the lines around his eyes skewed the number. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting. He wore a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a leather apron that had seen hard use. He was drying a glass with a cloth that probably wasn't making the glass cleaner, and he was looking at her the way men look at something that doesn't match what they were expecting. He kept drying the glass. Abigail walked to the bar and set her wooden box down on it. "You're Caleb Holt," she said. It wasn't a question. He set the glass down. "I am. I'm Abigail Mercer. I believe we had correspondence through Mrs. Paulson's agency in Denver." Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of an objection. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the flour sack, back to her face, and then around the room in the way people look around a room when they need to decide whether they're going to say the thing they're thinking. He decided he was. "I wrote asking for a wife," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "Not—" He stopped himself, then didn't stop himself. "I wrote specific requirements, Miss Mercer. I don't know what Mrs. Paulson told you, but I think there's been some kind of confusion here." Abigail looked at him. "What kind of confusion?" He didn't answer directly. He picked the glass back up. Behind her, one of the card players had stopped pretending to think about cards. "I'm just saying," Caleb said, that perhaps you were misled about the nature of the arrangement. You're saying I'm not what you asked for. He said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. One of the men at the nearest table let out a short laugh, the kind that's an invitation for others to join. Two more did. It moved around the room like a small, ugly thing looking for somewhere to land. Abigail heard it. She didn't move. She had a very particular stillness to her, not the stillness of someone who is frightened or frozen, but the stillness of someone who is choosing exactly how to respond and taking all the time they need to make that choice. "All right," she said. The laughter settled. "I understand." She pulled the strap of her flour sack up higher on her shoulder and tucked her wooden box back under her arm. "Where is your kitchen?" Caleb blinked. "What?" "Your kitchen, the cooking area, where food is prepared." She looked past him toward the door at the back of the bar. "Is that it?" He turned to look at the door as if he'd forgotten it existed. Yes, but I'll take a look at it." "Miss Mercer, you haven't turned me away yet," she said. "You've only indicated that you're considering it. Until you tell me to leave, I'm going to look at your kitchen." She looked at him steadily. "Unless you'd prefer to make that decision without knowing what I can do." The room was quiet now. Even the sleeping man seemed to have shifted slightly. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face, the defensive set of it, the readiness to dismiss, shifted a fraction. "It's through there," he said. "Tut-tut." The kitchen was a disaster. Not the dramatic kind with broken furniture and scorched walls, but the slow, depressing kind that happens when someone stops caring and then stops noticing that they stopped caring. A cast iron stove that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. A prep table with a gouged surface. Pots stacked in no particular order. A small pantry off to the left where a sack of flour had gotten damp and hardened into a single shape that was no longer useful for anything. And in the far corner, behind a stack of empty crates, a bread oven. Abigail crossed the room and moved the crates aside. The oven was large. Larger than she expected, built of fitted stone with an iron door. She opened the door and crouched down and looked inside. She ran one finger along the interior and brought it back black with old ash. But the stone was intact. The door hinges were tight. The flue above was sound. She stood up. Behind her, Caleb had followed as far as the doorway and stood with his arms folded across his chest in the manner of a man who is trying to look like he isn't curious. "When did you last use this?" she asked, nodding at the bread oven. "Couple years." "Who built it?" A pause. "My wife." Abigail didn't react to that, didn't make anything of it. "What's cooking in this kitchen now?" He looked at the stove. "Whatever Ned can manage." "Ned?" He works the bar. He does some cooking." "What kind of cooking?" Caleb's jaw shifted. "Beans, mostly. Salt pork. Bread when he has time, though it doesn't come out right." Abigail walked to the pantry and took stock of what was there. 2 more flour sacks, sealed and dry. Lard, salt, a small barrel of molasses, dried beans in a clay pot, a string of onions hanging from a nail, a half-wheel of cheese that was drying out at the edges. She came back to the prep table and set her flour sack down and opened it. She removed a small tin of baking powder, a cloth bag of dried herbs that she'd tied shut herself, and a knife in a leather sheath that she set aside. "Here's what I'll do," she said. "Tonight I'll make supper for everyone in this building. Whatever cowboys walk through that door, whatever they order, I'll feed them. Bread, hot food, something better than they've had in this place in a long time." She looked at him. "By sunrise, you'll know whether what I can do is worth anything to you. Then you can decide." Caleb stared at her. "Why would you?" "Because I've come a long way," she said, "and I'd like the chance to show you who you're actually looking at before you send me away." He stood there in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he unfolded his arms and looked at the bread oven, and then back at her. "Ned's off tonight," he said. "There's nobody to... I'll manage. There might be 15 men coming through here for supper. Then I'll need more flour. Do you have a line of credit at the general store?" He looked at her in a way that was almost, she thought, the beginning of respect. Not yet, but something close to the door of it. I do, he said. Then I'll need you to take me there before it closes. Abigail had learned to cook the way most women on the frontier learned, not in a school, not from a book, but from necessity and from watching and from the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to let a thing beat her. Her mother had run a boarding house in Ohio, and before Abigail was 12, she could time 4 dishes across 2 stoves and know by smell alone which one needed attention. She had cooked for her family through hard years and lean ones. She had cooked for a dying father, for a brother who came back from a war with pieces of himself missing. She had cooked for neighbors who couldn't pay and for her own hunger, and for the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself but sits in the body like something swallowed wrong. She was not a perfect cook. She burned things sometimes and overseasoned other things, and she had never once in her life made a pastry that looked as good as it tasted. But she was fast, and she was steady, and she could feed a room of strangers with whatever was on hand and make them feel, in some way they couldn't quite explain, that someone had thought about them. That was the part she'd learned you couldn't teach. She got the bread oven burning by 4 o'clock. Caleb had shown her where the wood was kept, a lean-to out back against the building, and she'd brought in enough to keep the fire going through the evening. She mixed the first loaves at the prep table while the oven came up to temperature, working the dough with the flat, deliberate pushes of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She made 4 large loaves to start. Then she put a pot of beans on the stove with the onions and the salt pork cut into chunks, and she added molasses and black pepper and a pinch of the dried herbs from her bag, and she let it begin its slow, patient business of becoming something people would want. She had just started on a second batch of bread when the kitchen door opened and a boy came in. He was about 12, narrow-shouldered, with a mop of dark hair and the kind of expression that suggested he'd gotten used to being told to go away. He stopped when he saw her. "Who are you?" he said. "Abigail Mercer." "Who are you?" "Eli." He looked at the oven, the dough on the table, the pot on the stove. "What are you doing?" "Cooking supper." He looked at her as if this required further explanation. "Mr. Holt doesn't have a cook." "He does tonight." She pointed at a stool in the corner. "You can sit there if you like, or you can go. Either is fine." Eli sat down on the stool. He watched her with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who has learned that watching is the best way to understand things. "You're the male bride, he said after a while. Abigail didn't look up from the dough. "Where did you hear that?" "Tom Briggs told everyone. He was in the saloon when you came in." He paused. "He said Mr. Holt didn't want you." She pressed the heel of her palm into the dough and turned it. "Tom Briggs talks a lot, does he?" "Pretty much constantly." Eli pulled his knees up to his chest on the stool. "Are you going to leave?" "I haven't decided yet." "Mr. Holt said you were cooking to prove something." "Did he say that?" "He told it to Jimmy Crane at the bar. He didn't know I was listening." Abigail smiled at the dough. "Well, yes, I suppose I am." "What are you trying to prove?" She thought about it for a moment, working the dough in a steady rhythm. "That I'm worth more than I look," she said. Then she thought about that and amended it. That what a person looks like and what they're capable of aren't always the same thing. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Holt looks like he's capable, but he mostly just drinks and looks at the floor." Abigail glanced up at him. "Is that so?" "He didn't always. My pa said he used to be different." Eli looked at the wall. "Before Mrs. Holt died." She let that sit for a moment without pressing on it. "How long have you been around here, Eli?" 2 years, since my folks—" He stopped. "I do errands, mostly. Mr. Holt lets me sleep in the tack room above the stable." She looked at him then, a real look, the kind that took stock of what was actually in front of her. The thinness of him, the careful way he held himself, as if he'd learned that taking up too much space could be a mistake. "Are you hungry now?" she said. "I'm always hungry." She cut a thick slice off the small emergency loaf she kept aside, spread it with lard, and handed it to him. He took it with both hands and ate it with the controlled urgency of someone who has learned not to show how hungry they actually are. Neither of them said anything for a few minutes. "Eli," she said, while she shaped the second batch of loaves, You think you could tell me who usually comes in here for supper? Names, what they do, whether they've got families. He looked at her with a kind of pleased surprise, the look of someone who's never been asked to contribute information before. Yeah, he said, I can do that. And he told her. For the next hour, as the bread rose and the beans simmered, and the kitchen filled up with the kind of warmth that a room gets when something real is happening in it, the boy talked, and Abigail listened and remembered every word. The first cowboys started coming in around 6 o'clock. There were 8 of them from 2 different outfits, trail dusty and tired, men who'd been riding fences all day and wanted something hot and didn't particularly expect to get it. They came through the bat-wing doors and settled at tables and called for Caleb, and Caleb came out from behind the bar and told them there was supper if they wanted it. What kind of supper? Said a man named Garrett, who Eli had told her was a foreman for the Grady outfit and had a specific dislike of beans that had been cooked without enough salt. Hot beans and bread, Caleb said. Garrett made a face. Same as always, then. Not quite, Caleb said, and he didn't seem entirely sure why he'd said it. Abigail came out with the first tray herself. She'd found a clean cloth somewhere in the back and draped it over the boards. She set down the bread, 4 thick slices, still warm, the crust the dark gold color it should be, and a bowl of beans that smelled of molasses and pepper and something else. The herbs she'd added, which nobody could quite identify, but which made the nose want more. She set it in front of Garrett. He looked at it. He looked at her. You're the new woman, he said. Abigail Mercer. Thought Holt said, he said he was considering the situation, she said. Try the bread. He tore a piece off and ate it, and his expression did not change in any dramatic way because men like Garrett don't let their faces do dramatic things. But there was a shift, the slightest unclenching of the jaw, the settling of the shoulders. That's decent bread, he said. Thank you. What are those herbs? A few things, thyme mostly. He looked down at the beans and tried those. He ate in silence for a moment. Salt pork? Yes. Usually it's just... He moved his hand vaguely. Just beans. I know, she said. By 7 o'clock, there were 12 men in the saloon and all of them were eating. By 8 o'clock, there were 16, including 3 she hadn't expected. 2 men from an outfit north of town and a cattle broker who'd been passing through and smelled the bread from the street and walked in. She ran out of the first batch of loaves and went back and cut into the second. She refilled the bean pot twice. She made a pan of cornbread on the stove because she'd found cornmeal in the back of the pantry, and it seemed wrong not to use it, and the cornbread came out uneven on top but tasted right, and a man named Dukes ate 3 pieces and then apologized to nobody in particular. She brought things out herself, and when she was back there, she was watching the stove and keeping count and adjusting, and she didn't have time to notice whether people were impressed or not. She didn't have time to feel the strangeness of the night or the weight of what was at stake. There was only the work. Eli had materialized as a helper somewhere around 6:30 without being asked. He carried bowls and refilled cups and moved around the room with the quick, unobtrusive efficiency of someone who understood that being useful was the best way to be invisible when invisible was the safer thing to be. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Around 9 o'clock, after the main rush had settled, and men were sitting back with their cups and talking at a lower volume, the particular sound of a room that's been fed, Caleb came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway again, same as before. The apron was still on. He had the look of a man who had been watching something he wasn't sure how to interpret. Abigail was scrubbing the pot at the wash basin, her sleeves pushed up, her hair escaping from its pin in 2 or 3 places. There's nothing left, Caleb said. She glanced at him. I know. I kept count. Every single thing you made, 16 men plus Eli. The cornbread stretched further than I expected. She set the pot aside and started on the next one. Did anyone complain? He looked at her for a moment. No. Did Tom Briggs eat? Tom Briggs ate 2 bowls and asked if there was pie. There wasn't. I know that. He came inside the kitchen then, the first time he'd actually come in, not just stood in the doorway. He picked up a towel without thinking about it and began drying the bowl she'd just set aside. Garrett told me the bread was better than his mother's, he said. He didn't say it to me. He said it to Vic, but I was standing right there. That's a generous thing to say about someone's mother's bread. Garrett's mother was not known for her baking. Abigail made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close enough. They worked like that for a few minutes in silence, her washing, him drying, the sounds of the saloon, a low murmur through the door. The oven needs cleaning properly, she said. I can do it tomorrow if you have the right brushes. There are brushes in the lean-to. I'll find them. He put a pot on the shelf and stood there looking at it. The bread oven hasn't been... He stopped. Started again. Margaret built that oven. My wife. She'd ordered the stone from somewhere up in Cheyenne. Took 3 months to come. He paused. I haven't. Nobody's used it since she passed. Abigail kept washing. She didn't fill the silence with anything, just let it be what it was. The bread smelled like... He didn't finish that sentence. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. She said it simply, without performance, the way you say a thing you mean. He nodded once, the short nod of someone accepting something they don't have a better response to. I have a ledger, she said after a moment. Back in my box. I've been keeping a running count of what was used tonight and what the rough cost was, and what those meals would have sold for if you'd been charging market price. She looked over her shoulder at him. You've been undercharging. He blinked. I've been... by a fair amount. I can show you in the morning. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression he made when something surprised him, and he didn't want to show that it had. You keep ledgers. I kept the books for a boarding house for 6 years, and before that I helped my mother with hers. You didn't mention that in the letters. You didn't ask. You asked about cooking and whether I was in good health and whether I had experience with hard work. She turned back to the wash basin. I answered all 3. He was quiet for a moment. You did, he said. She finished the last pot and dried her hands. She turned around to face him. I know I'm not what you imagined, she said. She kept her voice level, no apology in it, no edge either. I know that when you wrote to Mrs. Paulson's agency, you had a picture in your mind of someone else, and I can't do anything about that. She looked at him directly. But I can tell you what I am. I can cook. I can keep books. I can work from before sunrise until after dark without complaining about it. I can see what's wrong with a business, and I can figure out how to fix it. She paused. Whether that's enough is your decision, but I'd like you to make it based on what you actually know about me, not based on how I looked walking off a stagecoach. The kitchen was quiet except for the last faint ticking of the cooling stove. Caleb Holt stood there for a long moment, the towel still in his hands, looking at her in a way that was different from how he'd looked at her before. You can stay in the room at the end of the boarding hall, he said. For now. Thank you. It's not, he started, stopped. It's not settled, any of it. I know. But you can stay. She nodded. She reached past him for her wooden box on the prep table. I'll want to go over your finances in the morning, she said. All of them. Whatever you have. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was probably the appropriate reaction. I'm not asking to take anything from you. I'm asking to see where things are. She looked at him. You're in debt, Mr. Holt. I could see that from the way the room looked when I walked in this morning. You've been trying to hold this place together without the tools to do it, and without anyone to help you do it. She said it plainly, not cruelly. I'd like to understand what we're actually dealing with. He didn't argue with any of that, which told her something. All right, he said. Morning then. She woke before sunrise. She always did. The room at the end of the boarding hall was small, and the mattress was thin, and the window looked out at the back wall of the building next door, which didn't look like much. But the room had a door that latched and a nail for her coat and a wooden floor that was level, and she had slept in worse. She lay there for a moment in the gray, early light and listened to the town waking up. A rooster somewhere, the distant sound of something metal against metal, the creak of someone walking on the floorboards above. She had not cried on the stagecoach. She had not cried when Caleb Holt said what he said in front of those men. She had felt it land, felt the particular quality of that kind of humiliation, the specific way it sat in the chest. But she had not cried because she had learned a long time ago that crying was something you did when there was nothing else to do, and she had always been able to find something else to do. She was in Black Hollow for a reason. That reason hadn't changed because a man didn't like what he saw. She thought about the bread oven, the sound of the stone when she'd opened the iron door, the way Caleb's voice had changed when he mentioned his wife's name. She thought about Eli eating that bread slice with both hands. She got up, she made her bed. She put her hair up tight and pinned it. She took her wooden box from the floor and opened the brass clasp and removed the ledger from inside. It was her own. She'd bought it in Denver with money she'd been saving for 2 years, money set aside from the boarding house wages and from taking in mending and from selling preserves at the market in the summer. She had kept her own accounts in it, not because she had much to account for, but because the discipline of it mattered to her. She had extra pages at the back. She turned to the first clean one. She wrote, Black Hollow, Holt's Saloon and Boarding, current situation, and she began to write down everything she'd seen. Caleb Holt's finances were, in the polite language of accountancy, a significant challenge, and in any other language, they were a disaster that had been wearing a hat to look taller than it was. He spread the papers across the bar in the morning, in the hour before anyone came in, and Abigail stood beside him and went through them methodically. The saloon had debts to the general store, to a lumberyard in Cheyenne, and to a moneylender in town, a man named Porter who wasn't the source of the real problem, but who was charging interest at a rate that would cripple a functioning business, let alone one that was barely hanging on. There were also 2 notes she looked at for a long time. They were loan agreements, large ones, both made out to a company called Cane Valley Land and Development, signed by Caleb Holt nearly a year ago. The terms were complicated in the particular way that complicated terms are made to look like generosity until you read them twice. These loans, she said, what were they for? Caleb stood with his hands on the bar and looked at the papers the way people look at things they don't want to look at. The roof needed doing, then there was a dry summer and the board season was bad. He paused. Victor Kane offered the money. He's the largest landholder in the valley. He said it was a neighborly thing. What are the repayment terms? He pointed to a line of text that was smaller than the lines around it. She read it. She read it again. These aren't repayment terms, she said. This is a conversion clause. She looked up at him. If you default, not just miss payments, but miss by more than 60 days, the debt converts to a lien against the property, against the building. He looked at her. He could take the saloon, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I know that, he said. He said it in a low, flat way that told her he'd been trying not to know it. Have you talked to a lawyer? There isn't one in Black Hollow. He picked up the paper and set it back down. Nearest one's in Hatcher, which is 2 days' ride. Abigail looked at the papers again. When did you last make a payment on these? Silence. Caleb? 4 months ago. She did the arithmetic. The 60-day window had already closed. She set the papers down and was quiet for a moment, turning it over. You're not the only one he's done this to, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd understood it by the 3rd time she read the conversion clause. This was language somebody had refined through practice. Are there other ranchers in this valley with Kane's name on their notes? Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. I've heard things. I don't know for certain. Who would know? He thought. Maybe Walt Grady. He runs the biggest outfit east of here, and the Dennisons, they've had a hard 2 years. He paused. Tom Briggs might know something, and Tom talks, which means everything he knows gets around eventually. She gathered the papers into a neat stack and put them back into the order she'd found them. I want to see these again later, she said, and I want to sit down with you tonight and go through the saloon accounts. What's actually coming in and what it should be coming in, because those 2 things are different from what I can see. He was watching her with that expression again, the one that wasn't quite used to her yet. Why are you doing this? He said. She looked at him. Because you haven't sent me away yet. That's not... He shook his head slightly. That's not a real answer. She thought about it for a moment, more honestly. Because this place could be something, she said. The kitchen, the building, this town, it could be something real. And it's being strangled by debt and by a man who set that trap deliberately. She put her hand flat on the bar. I don't like that. He looked at her hand on the bar. He looked at her face. Something was changing in how he looked at her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a door opens when someone has been pushing on it for a long time and finally applies the right pressure. 16 men ate here last night, he said. Yes. I counted the same number of men coming in for breakfast this morning that I've seen in weeks, maybe months. She nodded. Word travels. Garrett told 3 men at the livery stable before the sun was even up. He said it in a slightly bewildered way. He said he hadn't eaten that well since... He stopped. Since your wife was cooking, she said. He looked away. Yeah. She didn't say anything to that. She picked up her ledger. Let me see the rest of the books, she said. All of them, and then we should talk about what the kitchen needs to operate properly going forward. She glanced toward the back. The bread oven should be a regular part of things. Bread is the cheapest cost and the highest return. Every cowboy who smells bread from the street is a man who walks through that door. He turned to look at the back hallway and the door to the kitchen beyond. Margaret always said that, he said. She was right. Abigail opened her ledger to a fresh page. She built a good oven. Caleb Holt stood there at the bar in the early morning light, in the hour before the town fully woke up, and something about his face changed slightly. One of those changes that's too small to name but that you can feel in the room, the way you can feel pressure change before weather. He turned back to her. I'll get the rest of the books. Thank you. He went through the door behind the bar. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. Through the cracked mirror on the wall, she caught a glimpse of herself. Hair pinned, coat still on, ledger open in her hands, the faded saloon surrounding her in the dimness. She didn't look like much, she knew that. She had never looked like much. She had a face that was honest rather than pretty, and a build that was sturdy rather than graceful, and the kind of hands that told you exactly what kind of life had been lived. She had been told, at various points in her life and in various ways, that she was not enough. Not enough for this, not enough for that. Not quite what anyone was looking for. She looked at her own reflection in the cracked mirror for a moment. Then she looked down at the open ledger and started writing. There was work to do. The books were worse than she'd thought, and she'd thought they were bad. Caleb came down with 2 shoeboxes and a leather satchel, and when he spread everything across the bar table, Abigail sat down and went through it all without saying much for the better part of an hour. Receipts folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn through. Tallies written on the backs of envelopes. A ledger that had been kept reasonably well for the first year and then progressively less well as time went on. The handwriting shifting from careful to hurried to, at one point, completely absent. 3 months with no entries at all, which she recognized as the period after a person stops being able to make themselves do the ordinary things. She didn't ask about that. What she could see was this: the saloon took in enough money to survive. Barely. On a good week, it covered the food costs and the basic supplies and Ned's wages and had a little left over. On a bad week, it didn't cover any of that, and the difference went on to the tab with the general store, and the tab grew, and meanwhile the cane loan sat in the background like a stone wall that was slowly moving closer. Caleb sat across from her with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and watched her read. Say what you're thinking, he said finally. She looked up. You've been selling drinks at prices from 4 years ago. He frowned. The men expect what they're used to. That's different from what's reasonable. She turned the ledger so he could see the column she'd been working on. You raise the drink price by 2 cents, and you raise the meal price by 5 cents, and in 1 month, you cover the store tab. She tapped the page. In 3 months, you've got enough to make a payment on the cane note. If I raise prices, men go to Dooley's place down the road. Not if the food here is better. He looked at her. They went to Dooley's because there was no reason to come here, she said. Give them a reason and they'll come here. Men are creatures of comfort, and comfort follows good food. She closed the ledger. Last night, 16 men came. This morning you said the breakfast count was up. You haven't raised a price yet. He drank the coffee finally. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. You make it sound straightforward. It's not straightforward, it's just arithmetic. She pulled the cane notes back toward her. This part isn't arithmetic. He set the cup down. The conversion clause, she said. You're already past the 60-day window, which means technically he has the right to file the lien today. She looked at the signature at the bottom. Kane's name was written in the large, confident script of a man who signs things knowing they'll be honored. Has he said anything to you? Come around. He came in about 6 weeks ago, Caleb said. He was looking at the table, not at her. Had a drink? Friendly enough? Said he hoped business was picking up. His jaw moved. He smiled the whole time. Because he already knew the clock had run. I didn't know that. I didn't read the... He stopped. I should have read it more carefully. I know that. She didn't say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say. He knew it. Saying it again wouldn't help either of them. He hasn't filed yet, she said, which means he's waiting for something. Either he wants more properties to move on at once, or he's waiting for a moment that benefits him somehow. She set the papers down. Either way, we have a little time. Caleb looked at her with the word "we" clearly sitting in his head, not quite settled. She didn't explain it. She picked up her ledger and made a note. The kitchen changed in the days that followed. The way a room changes when someone decides to actually live in it rather than just pass through. She scrubbed the stove down to the iron and re-seasoned it. She organized the pantry so that everything had a place and the place made sense. She cleaned the bread oven properly with the brushes from the lean-to, working the ash and residue out of the stone until it was ready to work the way it had been built to work. And the first morning she fired it up with a proper full load of loaves. The smell reached the street before 8 o'clock. By 9 o'clock there were 7 men at the tables who hadn't been planning to eat breakfast at Holt's Saloon when they woke up. Ned, who turned out to be a short, worried-looking man in his 50s, who had been doing his honest best with insufficient skills and even less enthusiasm, watched her work for 2 days with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to feel grateful or replaced. She figured that out on the second day and handed him a knife. You know how to butcher? She said. He looked at the knife. Some. Good. I need the salt pork cut different than how it's been done. Smaller pieces, more surface to cook on. She showed him what she meant on the first piece. You try. He tried. He didn't get it quite right the first time, but the second time was better, and she told him so, and something in his posture changed. He started coming in earlier. By the end of the first week, Ned was doing things in the kitchen he'd never done before. Not because he'd suddenly developed talent, but because someone had shown him how and expected him to manage it and hadn't treated him like an obstacle. He wasn't a cook. He was never going to be a cook. But he became useful in the way that a willing person with clear direction becomes useful, and that was enough. Eli was there every evening. She hadn't asked him to be, and she hadn't told him not to be, and he seemed to understand the implicit arrangement. Stay out of the way when things are moving fast, make himself useful when there's a gap, don't break anything. He was good at staying out of the way. He was good at most things that required paying attention, which she suspected came from years of having to read rooms carefully in order to be safe in them. She didn't ask about his family. She knew enough from what he'd said the first night, and the rest she could see. One evening near the end of the week, she found him at the prep table, not doing anything, just sitting there with a piece of charcoal and the back of an old receipt, making marks on the paper. She looked over his shoulder. He'd drawn the saloon, the bar, the tables, the cracked mirror, in a few quick lines that caught the shape of things better than they had any right to. You draw, she said. He looked at the paper like he'd been caught doing something wrong. Just messing around. That's good. Where'd you learn? Nowhere. He turned the paper over. My ma used to. I picked it up, I guess. She reached past him and turned the paper back over. Don't do that, she said. He looked at her. Don't hide it. She went back to the stove. Things you're good at aren't things to be embarrassed about. He was quiet for a moment. Mr. Holt said I waste too much time with it. Mr. Holt, she said carefully, is working through some things. The saloon had filled steadily through that first week. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulating way that good things often grow. One man telling another, a family stopping in on a Thursday when they hadn't planned to. A rancher's wife mentioning to another rancher's wife that the bread at Holt's was worth the trip in from the eastern pastures. Caleb watched it happen with a look she'd started to recognize, a guarded, slightly disbelieving look, The look of someone who has been disappointed enough times that they've started to distrust good things before they've had time to become good things. He was behind the bar most of the time, which was where he was comfortable and where he kept the particular careful distance he'd maintained from her since the first morning. Polite, practical. He answered her questions directly, and he did what she suggested, more or less. And sometimes she caught him watching her from across the room with that expression she couldn't quite put her finger on. Not hostile, not warm. Something in between that hadn't made up its mind. On Saturday evening, the saloon was the fullest it had been, she suspected, in years. Every table was occupied. Ned was working the bar with Caleb because there was too much to pour for one person, and she and Eli were moving food out of the kitchen as fast as she could make it. And somewhere around 8 o'clock, a family came in. A man and a woman and 2 children, which was not typical saloon clientele, and everyone knew it. The man was embarrassed about it. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked around at the room full of cowboys and said, "Sorry, we heard there was food. We've been driving since this morning, and the children are—" "Sit down," Abigail said. She was passing with a tray, and she set it over her shoulder without breaking stride. "There's room at the table by the window." The woman, her name turned out to be Clara Dennison, got the children seated and then helped hold the smallest one, who was about 4 and had gone the specific kind of limp that a very tired child goes. Clara Dennison had dark circles under her eyes and a quality of strain around her mouth that Abigail recognized, the strain of someone who has been worried for a long time about something they can't fix. She brought them food herself: bread, beans, a piece of the roasted chicken she'd done on the spit. Not fancy, but real. Clara looked at the food and then up at Abigail with an expression that was embarrassingly close to tears. "Don't," Abigail said gently. "Just eat." Clara laughed, a short, surprised laugh, and straightened up and told the children to eat properly. Abigail stayed a moment longer than she needed to. "You're the Dennison family, from east of the Grady outfit." Clara looked at her with slight surprise. "That's right? Your husband, he has a note with Cane Valley?" Something crossed Clara's face, fast and complicated. She glanced toward the bar where her husband was talking with Caleb. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm starting to understand the shape of something," Abigail said, "and I'd like to talk with you, not tonight, but soon." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She had the look of someone who wants very badly to trust something and has been wrong about trusting things before. "Come out on Monday," Clara said finally. "Henry goes to check the east fence Monday mornings. We can talk." Abigail nodded. "I'll be there." Then, on Sunday morning, before the kitchen was open, she walked the length of the main street of Black Hollow for the first time since she'd arrived. It wasn't much of a town. She'd seen smaller, but not many that felt this tired. The general store was solid. The livery stable was well kept. The man who ran it, a broad-shouldered Mexican-American named Reyes, maintained his place with obvious pride. There was a barber shop, a dry goods store that doubled as a kind of land office, and at the end of the street a building that had once been something, a meeting hall maybe, or a small hotel, and was now just a big empty structure with boarded windows. She stood in front of that building for a while. Then she walked back. She found Caleb in the saloon, doing something to the hinge on the front door that had been sticking for what looked like months. "The building at the end of the street," she said. "Who owns it?" He looked up from the hinge. "Kane." She stood there. "He bought it 2 years ago," Caleb said, going back to the hinge. "Said he was going to put in a hotel. Nothing ever got built." She looked down the street, even though she couldn't see the building from where she stood. "He owns property here in town as well." "He owns property everywhere." Caleb straightened up and tested the door. It moved more smoothly. "He's got land running from the North Ridge all the way to where the river bends south. Bought most of it in pieces over the last 4 or 5 years. He looked at her. Why? She had been building a picture in her mind since the morning she'd read those loan documents, adding to it each day, each conversation, each piece of information she gathered from the men who came through the kitchen and talked while they ate the way people talk when they're comfortable and not paying attention to what they're saying. She didn't lay the whole picture out for him yet, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wasn't done building it. "I'm going to the Dennison place Monday," she said. I want to look at their loan documents if they'll let me. He looked at her steadily. Abigail, what do you think you're looking at? I'm not sure yet, but you have an idea. She looked at him. Kane's not money lending because he needs the income, she said. He's got more land than he needs already. So why issue loans to struggling ranchers on terms that are almost designed to end in default? She paused. What's coming to this valley that makes the land worth more than it is right now? Caleb was quiet for a moment. There's been talk, he said slowly, about a railroad. Northern Pacific is surveying routes. There's been men through here, couple months back, didn't say who they worked for, but asked a lot of questions about the terrain. She looked at him. If a rail line comes through this valley, he said, and she could hear him working it out as he said it, whoever owns the land corridor makes a fortune, she said. 10 times, 20 times what the land is worth for ranching. She picked up the hinge tool he'd set down and turned it in her hands. He doesn't want the ranches, Caleb. He wants the land under them. The loans are just the mechanism. The silence in the saloon was different from the usual morning quiet. It had weight to it. How many families? Caleb said. It came out low. I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to find out. He looked past her toward the front window, where the main street of Black Hollow lay in the flat morning light, ordinary and small, and, she now understood, almost certainly sitting on ground that a man in a good suit somewhere was already counting as his. We should have seen it, he said. You were dealing with other things, she said. He counted on that. A man who's worried about feeding his family doesn't have time to look up and see what's being built around him. She put the tool down. That's why it works. Caleb turned back to her. There was something different in his face now. Not quite the removed, polite distance of the past week, but something more direct, more present. What do you need from me? He said. It was a small shift, those 4 words, but she felt it. He had spent the past week watching her, assessing, maintaining the careful gap of a man who'd learned that closing gaps leads to hurt. And now, standing in his own saloon in the Sunday morning quiet, he was asking her what she needed from him. She thought about the answer carefully before she gave it. I need you to start talking to your neighbors, she said. Not about Kane yet, just talk to them. Walt Grady, the Dennisons, whoever you trust. Find out how they're doing, whether they're struggling, whether they've had dealings with Kane Valley. She looked at him. You have standing here. You've been in this town for years. People trust you more than they trust me. He looked slightly uncomfortable with that. I haven't been particularly present with people. Not lately. I know, she said. That's why it'll mean something when you are. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The short, single nod she was starting to understand meant that he'd decided something. All right, he said. She picked up her ledger from the bar and headed toward the kitchen. Abigail? She stopped. Last night, he paused, seemed to decide something. It was the first Saturday night in 2 years I didn't count the empty chairs. He said it to the middle distance, not quite to her. I just thought you should know that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. She went into the kitchen. She stood at the prep table for a moment before she did anything, her hands flat on the worn surface. Then she started on the bread. The Dennison place was a 2-hour ride east, and Abigail borrowed Caleb's horse, a solid, unimaginative gray mare named Ruth, who had no interest in being hurried and made that clear from the first quarter mile. Clara Dennison met her at the gate before she'd even dismounted, which told Abigail that she'd been watching the road. The house was modest and well-kept in the way that modest houses are well-kept when the woman inside them refuses to let circumstances dictate standards. The porch had been swept. There were curtains in the windows. Out back, a kitchen garden that had been tended carefully despite the dry summer, the plants smaller than they should have been but alive, which was a kind of stubbornness Abigail recognized. Clara poured coffee without asking and set it on the kitchen table with a directness that Abigail appreciated. No performance, no pretense that this was a social call. Henry doesn't know you're coming, Clara said. She sat down across the table and folded her hands around her own cup. He wouldn't have liked it. Why? Because he's proud. She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way a woman says something she's had to make peace with. He doesn't want people knowing our business. Especially not someone who's... She stopped. Someone who's new, Abigail finished. I was going to say someone he doesn't know yet. Clara looked at her steadily. He'll come around. He just needs time, and he doesn't always have the luxury of it. Abigail drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter, the way frontier coffee usually was, and it was exactly what she needed. Can I see the loan documents? She said. Clara got up without a word and went to the back room. She came back with a tin box, the kind families kept important papers in, and she opened it and took out 2 folded documents and set them on the table. Abigail read them both. She read them slowly, the way she'd learned to read documents that had been designed to be misunderstood. The structure was identical to Caleb's. The same conversion clause, buried in the same position, written in the same careful legal language. The interest rates were slightly different. Denison's were higher, she noted. But the mechanism was the same. Default by 60 days, and the land became collateral. There was something else, though, something she hadn't seen in Caleb's papers. She leaned closer. In the second document, in a clause near the back that was labeled with the kind of dull heading designed to discourage reading, covenant of non-transfer and right of first refusal, there was a line that stopped her cold. Clara, she said, did anyone explain this section to you when you signed? Clara came around the table to look. Mr. Kane's man read it to us. He said it was standard, that it just meant we couldn't sell the land to anyone else while the loan was active without Kane's approval. That's part of what it says. Abigail set her finger on the line. This part says that if you sell, Kane has the right to purchase at the price of the original loan value, not market value, the loan value. Clara stared at the paper. When you took this loan, Abigail said, what was the land worth? Clara's jaw tightened. More than we borrowed. A lot more. A pause. Henry always said we could sell and come out ahead, if it ever came to that we'd never be completely stuck. She looked at the document. He doesn't know about this part. He should. He should. Clara sat back down heavily. He's going to be furious. She pressed her lips together. At himself, mostly. That's the worst kind. Abigail copied the clause into her ledger, word for word. She copied the loan number, the date, the name of the Kane Valley representative who'd witnessed the signing, a man called R. Maddox, which wasn't a name she'd seen before. Do you know other families in a similar situation? She said. I know the Browers lost their east pasture 2 months ago. They said they had to sell it to cover a debt. Clara looked at the table. I didn't understand at the time. I thought they'd just had a bad run. She looked up. You think Kane took it? I think there's a pattern, Abigail said, and patterns don't happen by accident. She rode back to Black Hollow with the afternoon sun at an angle that made the dust on the road look like it was lit from inside, and she thought the whole way. By the time she got back, Caleb had news. He was waiting for her in the saloon, which was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull, just Ned stacking chairs and a single cowboy sleeping in the corner who they both chose to ignore. I talked to Walt Grady, Caleb said. He was sitting at the bar with a cup he wasn't drinking, same as the other morning. She was starting to understand this was how he sat when he was working something out. He's got a Kane note, has had one for 18 months. He said he's been making payments fine, not worried about it. He looked at her. But when I asked him about the terms, really asked him, he got quiet. He said he'd have to look at the papers again. He hasn't read them carefully either. He's a rancher, Abigail. He runs 400 head and 18 men. He doesn't... Caleb shook his head. None of us are lawyers. We sign things that men in suits tell us are standard. She sat down across from him and opened her ledger on the bar. The Denisons have the same conversion clause you have. And something else. A right of first refusal set at loan value, not market value. She turned the ledger so he could see where she'd copied it. It means even if they could find a buyer and sell the land voluntarily, Kane would intercept the sale and buy it himself for a fraction of what it's worth. Caleb read the clause. He read it twice. She watched his face. He's got them both ways, Caleb said. From both ends, yes. Default, and he takes it through the lien. Sell, and he takes it through the right of first refusal. She put her finger on the page. The only way out is to pay the loan off in full. which these terms make very difficult to do. He sat back. He had the look of a man who is revising his understanding of something, and the revision is making things worse, not better. I should have... Stop. She said it gently but clearly. We can't spend time on what should have been read more carefully. We have to figure out what to do now. He looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind he hadn't quite managed in the first days. This one didn't have the distance in it. You said a railroad, he said. I think so. The surveying men you mentioned, the way he's assembling land in a line, North Ridge to the river bend, you said. That's not a ranching portfolio, that's a corridor. She closed the ledger. If a rail line comes through this valley, whoever holds that land strip sells it to the railroad for 10, 15 times what they paid. The loans were just the cheapest way to acquire it. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved down the street and pushed dust against the saloon window. How many families? He said. He'd asked that before and she hadn't had the answer. He was asking it again, which meant he'd been thinking about it. I don't know. I need to find out. She looked at him. That's why I need your help. Not mine. Yours. You know these people. They've known you for years. They'll talk to you in a way they won't talk to a woman they met 2 weeks ago. What do I say to them? You invite them to supper, she said. He blinked. To the saloon. To the saloon. A real supper. Not a business meeting, not a meeting at all officially, just a meal. She looked at the room around them, at the tables that had been filling up each night. People talk when they're eating. They relax. They stop being on guard. She paused. And when they're all in the same room and they start hearing that their neighbor has the same problem they thought was theirs alone, that's when something changes. Caleb thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, the particular kind of thinking that isn't deciding whether the idea is good, but deciding whether he's capable of the thing being asked of him. I haven't hosted anything in this town since Margaret died, he said. I know. People will wonder what it's about. Let them wonder. Tell them it's just supper, that you want to bring some people together. She looked at him steadily. You've been closed off here for 2 years, and everyone in this valley knows it. If Caleb Holt opens his door and invites people in, they'll come. Not because they know why, because they'll be curious, and because people always hope a closed door is about to open. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Kind of reckoning, she thought. The face of someone deciding to come back to something. All right, he said. Saturday. Bet. It took 4 days to arrange, and none of those days went smoothly. Walt Grady said yes immediately, and then sent word the next day that he couldn't come because of a fence situation on the north pasture, and then sent word the day after that he'd figured out the fence. Henry Dennison said no, Clara sent a note, then said yes, then showed up on Wednesday at the saloon and stood at the bar for 20 minutes talking to Caleb about cattle prices before the real reason he'd come in surfaced, which was to look at Abigail and decide something about her. She was in the kitchen when she noticed him watching her through the open door. She went to the doorway. Mr. Dennison, she said, you want to see the loan documents? He looked slightly startled. Clara said, I know what Clara said. You want to see them yourself. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in. He came in. He was a large, weathered man with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had worked outdoors his whole life and whose body showed it. Broad through the back, thick in the hands, with a slight permanent lean forward that came from years of walking into weather. She put the copies she'd made on the prep table and let him read them. He read for a long time. She went back to the stove and let him read. The right of first refusal, he said finally. Yes. At loan value. Yes. He was quiet. She could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, in the way of someone holding something back. When my father built that land, he said, he did it in 16 years. 16 years of... He stopped himself, set the papers down. My sons are supposed to... He stopped again. She turned around. His face had the rigid, set quality of a man who will absolutely not cry in front of a woman he met 4 days ago, and is putting considerable effort into making sure of it. I know, she said. I signed it, he said. I sat at that table and I signed it and I should have. You were in a hard year, and a man you had no reason to distrust offered you a way through it, she said. That's not stupidity, Mr. Dennison. That's how these things work. They work because they're designed to look like help. He looked at her. The rigidity in his face shifted slightly. Not gone, but cracked. The way things crack when you stop holding them quite so hard. What are you planning to do? He said. I need to understand the full size of it first, she said. How many families, which properties, what the combined value of the land is. She looked at him directly. And I need to get this information in front of someone with legal authority. A circuit court judge, a federal land office. Someone outside of Kane's reach. Kane's got reach in a lot of places. I know, but he doesn't have reach everywhere. Henry Dennison looked at the papers for another moment, then at her. I'll come Saturday, he said. By Friday, she had a count. 11 families. She wasn't certain it was complete. There were 2 more she hadn't been able to reach. But 11 confirmed, and each one with some version of the same loan structure, and most of them past or approaching the 60-day default window. 11 families, roughly 14,000 acres across the valley, laid out in a line that she'd sketched on the back of a piece of brown paper, marking each property with a small square. When she connected them, the shape was unmistakable. A corridor running from the northern ridge down through the valley floor and curving toward where the river bent south. She showed it to Caleb on Friday evening after the saloon closed. He stood at the bar and looked at the sketch for a long time. He's been planning this for years, Caleb said. At least 4, probably longer. She traced the line with her finger. The properties he bought outright are here, here, and here. The ones with loan mechanisms fill in the gaps. She stopped at one square. Your saloon. It's not a ranch, but it's on the main corridor through town. Whatever gets built here goes through your building or around it, and around it costs more. Caleb looked at the square representing his place. The place his wife had built the bread oven in. The place where he'd been trying to hold something together in the years since she'd gone. He was going to let me lose it, Caleb said. It wasn't outrage. It was quieter than that. The flat, clear sound of a thing understood. And I would have. Without you walking into that kitchen, I would have lost it and not fully understood why. She didn't say anything to that. She rolled the paper up carefully. Saturday, she said. We need all of them there. Every family you've contacted. I need them in the same room, eating together, and I need them to hear each other. And then what? We tell them what you found? I let them tell each other, she said. That's different. She looked at him. If I stand up and explain what Kane has done, some of them will be skeptical. Some of them will need to see it themselves, not be told. But when Henry Dennison hears Walt Grady describe a loan with a conversion clause, and Walt Grady hears that the Browers lost their east pasture through the same mechanism, she stopped. They'll see it. And when people see something themselves, it becomes real in a way that being told never achieves. Caleb was quiet. You've thought about this a long time. Since the first morning I read your papers. He looked at her in the particular way he'd developed over the past 2 weeks. Not the assessing look of the first days, but something more open than that. Something that was still finding its shape. Abigail, he said. She looked at him. I said some things when you walked in here, in front of those men. He wasn't looking away, which she suspected cost him something. I want you to know You don't need to, she said. I think I do. She waited. I said things I shouldn't have said, he said. It was wrong of me. The way I said it, in front of everyone, he stopped. You didn't deserve that. Before I knew a single thing about you, I decided what you were, and I was wrong. He paused. I've been wrong about a few things lately, and I'm trying to do better at admitting it. The saloon was quiet. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the room had the particular warmth of a place that's been full of people and is now still holding the echo of them. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I knew that first night. He looked at her with a slight furrow. How? Because you brought the towel, she said. He didn't understand that immediately, and she didn't explain it, the moment in the kitchen when he'd picked up the dish towel without thinking and dried the bowl beside her. the unconscious, unguarded gesture of someone who is, underneath everything, a person who shows up. She picked up the rolled paper from the bar. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow needs to go well." It went imperfectly, which was to say it went the way real things go. The Browers arrived an hour late because a wheel had given them trouble on the road, and their youngest child had gotten carsick and needed attending to before anyone could eat. Walt Grady and Henry Dennison shook hands with the stiffness of men who'd had some disagreement years ago that neither fully remembered but both still felt. Two families she'd counted on didn't show. The Parkers sent their eldest son alone, a young man of about 18 who sat in the corner and watched everything with wide eyes, and the Mullen family didn't appear at all, which she filed away with concern. But the others came. 11 adults, some with children in tow, filling up the tables in a saloon that had been cleaned and rearranged for the evening, extra chairs brought from the boarding rooms, the kitchen running at full capacity. Abigail had made everything she could think of. Bread, 3 full loads from the stone oven, the smell of it changing the quality of the room before anyone sat down. A large pot of stew with the beef she'd bought from Reyes at the livery, who supplemented his income with a small operation out back. Roasted corn, apple preserves that Clara Dennison had insisted on bringing, and which Abigail suspected Clara had stayed up half the previous night making. She fed them first. She fed them well, and she said almost nothing while she did it. Caleb moved through the room in a way she hadn't seen him move before. Not behind the bar, not at a distance, but among the tables, stopping to talk, refilling cups, asking about the fence situation and the dry summer with the specific personal questions of someone who actually knows who he's talking to. He wasn't smooth at it. He was a little rusty, and it showed, but it showed in an honest way, and people felt the difference. It took about an hour before the conversation started to find each other. It was Walt Grady who said it first, to Henry Dennison, loudly enough to carry to the next table. "I've been meaning to ask you, you ever have trouble with the Kane paperwork, the payment schedule?" Henry set down his fork. "What kind of trouble?" And then it began. Not all at once, not in any organized way. It moved around the room, the way sound moves. One voice, then another responding, then a third from across the room, leaning in to say, "Wait, you too?" She watched it happen from the kitchen doorway. She watched the moment. She could see the exact moment, when the isolation cracked. When these people understood that the thing they'd each been carrying privately, the thing they'd been ashamed of in the particular way people are ashamed of being deceived, had not happened to them alone. It had happened to all of them. And it had happened the same way, with the same documents and the same man's name on the bottom. Abigail walked out from the kitchen doorway and went to stand beside Caleb. She didn't say anything yet. Neither did he. Across the room, Henry Dennison had pulled out his copy of the loan documents. She'd told him to bring them, and he had, and was spreading them on the table, and Walt Grady was looking at them next to his own, and someone had found a lamp and brought it over. Clara Dennison caught Abigail's eye from across the room. Clara's expression was complicated. The complicated expression of someone watching a difficult truth become visible and feeling both the pain of it and the strange relief. Caleb said quietly beside her, "It's working." "It's starting," she said. "Working comes later." He looked at her. She looked at the room, the 11 families, the papers spread on the tables, the voices building slowly into something that had weight and direction, and felt the particular feeling of a thing that can't be undone. The moment before a door opens that won't close again. Victor Kane had built his scheme on the certainty that these people would never sit in the same room and compare notes. That certainty had just become his most significant problem. The room talked until past midnight. Abigail didn't try to organize it. She'd learned, in the years she'd spent around people who needed to work something out, that organizing people too early was the same as shutting them down. So she let it go the way it needed to go, messy, overlapping, occasionally loud, with 2 or 3 conversations happening at once, and someone's child falling asleep across 2 chairs in the corner and nobody bothering to move him. What came out of it, across those hours, was a clearer picture than even she'd assembled alone. The Browers had lost their east pasture not through a default, as she'd assumed, but through the right of first refusal clause. They'd found a private buyer, a man from Cheyenne willing to pay fair market price, and Kane's man Maddox had appeared within 2 days with the paperwork to exercise the right and bought the land himself at loan value. The Browers hadn't understood what had happened until Henry Dennison read the clause out loud at the table, and the color drained out of old Gerald Brower's face. "He was there in 2 days," Gerald said. "How did he even know we had a buyer?" Nobody answered that immediately. Then Walt Grady said slowly, "You used the bank in Hatcher to draw up the sale paperwork." "That's right. Kane's got a man at that bank." Grady said it with the flat certainty of someone who has just connected two things and wishes he hadn't. "His brother-in-law works the land deed filings." The room was quiet for a moment. "He's been watching the filings," Abigail said from where she stood near the bar. "Anytime a property with his loan attached to it tries to change hands, he knows." Gerald Brower was 71 years old and had built his land from nothing, and he sat at that table with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw set in the manner of a man trying very hard to stay in the room with his dignity intact. His wife put her hand over his. Nobody said anything for a moment, because some moments need to just be what they are. Then Henry Dennison said, "All right, so what do we do?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was the sound of a man deciding to move. Dad. They stayed at it until Abigail finally stood up and said plainly that they needed sleep and clear heads, and that there was no decision worth making past midnight that couldn't be made better at 9 in the morning. People filed out gradually, some of them stopping to shake hands in a way they hadn't when they'd come in, that particular handshake that happens when people have been through something together and are acknowledging it. Henry Dennison stopped at the door. He looked back at Abigail and said, "You knew this would happen tonight. The way you fed us first let us talk. You planned this." "I planned the supper," she said. "What happened after was yours." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Then he put his hat on and walked out. Clara was last. She squeezed Abigail's hand on the way past, a quick, firm grip, nothing sentimental about it, and then she was gone too. Caleb closed the door and stood with his hand on it for a moment. The saloon was a mess. Plates, cups, papers spread across 3 tables, a child's coat someone had forgotten on a chair. Eli was already moving through the room collecting things, because Eli understood that the work after was as real as the work before. 11 families, Caleb said, 11 that we know of. She was at the table where the documents had been spread, going through the copies she'd made during the evening, making sure she had everything. "The Mullins didn't come. I don't know what that means yet." "Jim Mullin's proud," Caleb said. "And he and Kane have had dealings other than the loan. Kane bought some timber rights from him 2 years back. He may feel he's got a different relationship with the man. Or he's already been got to." She looked at Caleb. "We can't assume either way. Someone should ride out there." "I'll go tomorrow." She nodded. She kept sorting the papers. "We need to get to Hatcher. The circuit court operates out of there every other month. Judge Ansel Rowe, from what Grady told me. He's due through in 3 weeks. 3 weeks isn't much time to prepare." "No." She put the papers into a neat stack and tied them with the string she kept in her coat pocket. "But Kane is going to move when he finds out people have been comparing notes. And he will find out. He's too well connected not to." She looked at the stack of papers. "We need to get this in front of a legal authority before he can file the liens and get any foreclosures started. Once land transfers start going through official channels, untangling them takes years and costs money. None of these families have." Caleb sat down in one of the chairs and leaned back and looked at the ceiling in the way of someone letting the weight of the evening settle. "The documents," he said. "The forgery thing. Grady mentioned something. I want to make sure I understood." "The Grady loan," she said, "has a witness signature on the second page, a man named Colton, who signed as an independent notary." She opened her ledger to the page where she'd copied it. "The same signature appears on 4 other documents from 4 different families, on 4 different dates, in what is supposed to be 4 different counties." She turned the ledger to face him. "Nobody can be in 4 places, which means either Colton signed documents he wasn't present for, or someone signed his name for him." Caleb looked at the page for a moment. "That's fraud." "That's not just fraud. That's forgery on legal instruments, which is a different category of crime." She sat down across from him. "It means the documents may not hold up, which means the liens may not hold up, which means the entire mechanism Kane has built, the whole structure, has a crack in it. He was looking at her in that way again, the way that had started in the kitchen the first week and had been quietly becoming something else. "You found all of this," he said. "We found it," she corrected. "I couldn't have gotten these documents without you getting people in the room." "That's generous." "It's accurate." She closed the ledger. "Get some sleep, Caleb." She didn't sleep much herself. She sat at the small desk in her room with a lamp and went through everything she had, all the copies, all her notes, the sketch of the land corridor, the list of families and loan amounts and dates. She organized it the way you organize something you're going to hand to a stranger who needs to understand it quickly, clearly, logically, with nothing assumed. She wrote a summary of the forgery evidence in plain language. She wrote a timeline of the property acquisitions. She wrote a description of the conversion clause and the right of first refusal and what they meant in plain terms, the way she would explain it to someone who'd never seen a legal document before. Because in her experience, judges appreciated clarity more than they appreciated people trying to sound like lawyers. She worked until the lamp oil got low. Then she set down her pen and looked out the window at the dark street. She thought about the Mullen family, about the bankman and Hatcher, about R. Maddox, whose name appeared on document after document as Kane's representative, and who had never, as far as she could tell, been questioned by anyone about anything. She thought about Victor Kane, a man she had not yet met, whose presence she knew only through the paper trail he'd left behind. Wealthy men who built schemes like this tended to believe in their own invisibility. They moved through the world so smoothly, with so many intermediaries between themselves and the mechanism, that the mechanism seemed natural, seemed like weather, seemed like the kind of bad luck that just happened to people. She'd seen it before, smaller in scale, but the same in kind. She knew what happened when men like that realized the mechanism had been seen. They moved fast, and they were not careful when they moved fast. Kane moved on Wednesday. She didn't know that until Thursday morning when Garrett rode into town with his jaw set and tied his horse outside the saloon before it was fully open and came in looking for Caleb. Caleb was in the kitchen with her. They'd developed a habit of going over the day's situation in the morning before anyone came in, and Garrett came through to find them both. "Kane's man Maddox was out at the Grady place yesterday afternoon," Garrett said. "He was still in his riding coat, dusty from the road. Served notice on Mr. Grady that the loan is in default and Kane Valley is initiating the lien process." Abigail set down her cup. "Walt said he'd made payments," Caleb said. "He had, but Maddox showed up with paperwork claiming the last payment was short by $11.30 and that the shortfall triggered the default clause." Garrett's voice had a controlled anger in it, the anger of a man who's keeping it managed because losing it won't help. $11. On a loan of $4,000. "That's manufactured," she said. "Of course it's manufactured. Walt knows what he paid. He's got his own records." He looked at her. "But Maddox has paperwork from the Kane Valley office saying otherwise. And until someone proves different, that paperwork is what a judge looks at." She stood up. "He knows," she said. "He found out about the supper. He's accelerating." Caleb was already at the doorway. "How long does Grady have before the lien files?" "Maddox said 30 days, but Walt said he doesn't trust that number, and neither do I." She was already across the kitchen, pulling on her coat. "Caleb, I need paper. Good paper, not receipt backs. And I need Eli." He looked at her. "What for?" "Eli writes clearly. I've seen it. I need someone to copy documents faster than I can copy them alone." She looked at Garrett. "Can you get word to the other families today? I need to know if anyone else has received a notice from Maddox in the last 48 hours. Garrett nodded. "I can ride. Take the East Road first, the Browers and the Dennisons. Then north to the Fowler place if you have time." She thought, "Don't go alone. Take someone Kane's people won't recognize." Garrett looked at her for a moment with the expression that men who are used to being the ones giving direction sometimes got around her. Not hostile, just recalibrating. Then he turned and went. Well, by mid-morning, she had Eli at the prep table with a stack of clean paper and a good pen she'd borrowed from the dry goods store, copying documents in his neat, careful hand while she compiled the summary pages. He didn't ask what it was for. He read what he was copying. She could tell by the way his eyes moved. But he didn't ask. He just copied, line by line, with the focused quiet of someone who understands that being trusted with something means doing it right. After about an hour, he said, without looking up from the paper, "This man Kane stole everyone's land." "He tried to," she said. "Is he going to get away with it?" She was writing and didn't stop writing. "Not if I can help it." Eli was quiet for another few minutes. "My pa had land," he said, "in Nebraska. Before—" He stopped. "Before things happened." She looked at him. He was still looking at the paper. "Was it taken?" she said. "Different way, but yeah." He dipped the pen. "There's always a man with paperwork." She looked at him for a moment, this 12-year-old boy with the careful hands and the old eyes, and felt something that didn't have a clean name. "Keep copying," she said. "This one's not getting away with it." He nodded and kept going. By Thursday evening, Garrett had confirmed it. 3 families had received notices: the Browers, the Fowlers, and, she had been afraid of this, a family named Cassell who hadn't been at the supper because she hadn't known about them until now, and who lived in the southwest corner of the valley on land that sat at the exact midpoint of the corridor she'd sketched. The Mullen family, when Caleb had ridden out to them on Monday, had been quiet and uncomfortable and had said they had no difficulties with Kane and had nothing to add to any discussions. Jim Mullen had not looked Caleb in the eye. She wasn't surprised, but she made a note of it. Caleb came in from delivering the news to Walt Grady on Thursday evening and sat at the bar and looked like a man who has been carrying something heavy all day and has set it down but can still feel the weight of it. "Grady's scared," he said. "He won't say it, but he is. He's got 3 generations in that land, and he's looking at 30 days. He's not going to lose it," she said. "You don't know. I know that what I have in that stack of papers," she pointed at the ledger and the bound documents on the bar, "is enough to get an emergency injunction if I can get it in front of the right person. 1 affidavit from Walt Grady confirming his payment record versus the Cane Valley claim, 1 comparison of the forged notary signatures across 4 documents, and a judge who isn't in Kane's pocket." She looked at him. "Do you know anything about Roe, the circuit judge?" "I know he's been on the circuit for 12 years and nobody's ever said he was bent." Caleb thought. "He's strict, impatient. Doesn't like people wasting his time." "Good. I don't plan to waste it." He looked at the papers. Then he looked at her. "You're going to Hatcher?" "Tomorrow morning, early. I'll come with you." She looked at him. He said it in the same tone he'd used when he said, "What do you need from me?" Direct, not offering, deciding. "It'll be 2 days there and back," she said. "I know. Ned can manage." "Ned can manage fine." He put both hands flat on the bar. "You're not riding to Hatcher alone with those documents, Abigail. Kane has a man at that bank. He may have other men. And whatever he does when things are moving slow, when things start moving fast, men like that—" He stopped. "You're not going alone." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He nodded. He looked slightly relieved, which he covered by standing up and going to do something behind the bar. They left before sunrise. Ruth the gray mare and Caleb's bay gelding, 2 days' food in a saddlebag, and a locked box behind Abigail's saddle that held everything she'd assembled: the original documents, the copies, the summary, the forgery comparison, and a letter signed by 7 of the 11 families authorizing her to act as their representative in presenting the matter to the court. Getting those signatures had taken 2 days of Caleb riding the valley, because some of the families needed time to think about it, and one man, Gerald Brower, had needed to sit with it overnight before he could bring himself to sign. Not because he distrusted her, but because putting his name on something and handing it to a woman he'd met 2 weeks ago meant admitting formally that he couldn't handle it himself. She'd understood. She'd waited. He'd signed. His wife had pressed his shoulder when he did. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, the way people ride when there's a lot to think about and talking would interrupt it. The valley opened up as they climbed the north road. The grassland still pale from the dry summer, but holding its shape, the ridgeline clear against the early sky. Caleb rode beside her with the easy posture of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, And she found herself thinking, not for the first time, about how different he was from the man she'd walked in on 3 weeks ago. Or not different, more visible. The man who had been behind the wall of grief and isolation and shame was the same man who had built this place and loved his wife and knew his neighbors by name and history. He'd just been unreachable for a while. She understood being unreachable. She'd had her own seasons of it. After a while, he said, "What happens if the judge won't see us without an appointment?" "Then I wait in his office until he does." He glanced at her. "That's your plan." "I found that waiting in someone's office is very effective. People are more uncomfortable with a woman who simply waits than you'd think." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That I believe." They rode on. The sun came up properly, and the light changed from gray to gold across the grass. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "When we get back," she thought about how to say it. "Kane is going to know what we did. He'll know we went to Hatcher and why, and he'll come here, to the saloon." "I know. I want you to be ready for what that looks like." She looked at him. "A man like that, when he walks into your place, he's going to try to make you feel small. It's the move. He'll act like nothing has changed, like you're still the man he lent money to who couldn't pay it back. He'll be calm about it because calm is how power shows itself." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And what should I do?" "Stand there," she said. "Just stand there and don't give him the room. You don't have to say much. You don't have to threaten anything." She looked ahead at the road. "You just have to let him see that the man he thought he had isn't the man who's there anymore." Caleb considered that. The horses moved steadily beneath them. "I've been that man he thought I was," he said. "For a while." "I know, and now you're not." He looked at her. She was watching the road, but she felt the look. "Because of you," he said. "Because of you," she said back. "I just opened the window a little." He didn't say anything after that for a while, but she noticed that his posture changed slightly. Something in the shoulders, something settling. They were still riding when she saw, far ahead, the outline of Hatcher beginning to emerge from the flatland. The water tower first, then the rooftops, then the street taking shape in the distance. She sat straighter in the saddle and thought about Judge Ansel Rowe, who was impatient and didn't like his time wasted. She planned to use every minute of it. Judge Rowe did not see them the first day. His clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers who was polite in the particular way of people who've been trained to be a barrier, told them the judge was occupied with existing cases and was not available for unscheduled consultations. Abigail thanked him and sat down in the chairs outside the clerk's office. Caleb sat beside her. "We're waiting," she said quietly. "I see that," he said. They waited 3 hours. The clerk came out twice with increasingly uncomfortable expressions. The second time he came out, Abigail was reviewing the documents in her lap, and she looked up and said pleasantly, "We're fine. Take your time." At 4:15 in the afternoon, the inner office door opened and a man came out. Judge Ansel Rowe, she presumed, because he had the look of a man who expected rooms to adjust to his presence, short and gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the permanent slight frown of someone who has been ruling on things for long enough that all situations present themselves to him as problems requiring resolution. He looked at them. He looked at the documents in Abigail's lap. "What is this about?" he said. Not a question. "Systematic land fraud across 11 families in the Black Hollow Valley," she said. "Forged legal instruments, manufactured defaults, and a scheme to fraudulently acquire a land corridor ahead of a railroad right-of-way." She met his eyes. "I have documentation for all of it." Rowe looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the documents. Then back at her. "Come in," he said. She gathered the papers. Caleb stood beside her and put his hand briefly on the doorframe, not blocking it, just touching it, in the way of someone steadying themselves before they walk through. Then they walked through. Judge Rowe spent 2 hours with them that first evening and then told them to come back in the morning. That night they stayed at a boarding house on Hatcher's main street. Separate rooms, which the landlady noted with visible relief. And Abigail sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall and tried to figure out if she'd said everything right. She went through the meeting in her head the way she always went through things, looking for the gaps, the places where she'd been unclear or where Ro's expression had shifted in a way she hadn't fully read. He'd been hard to read. That was the truth. He'd asked sharp questions, and she'd answered them as directly as she could. And when she'd laid out the forged notary signatures side by side on his desk, he'd been quiet for a long moment. But quiet could mean a lot of things. Caleb knocked on her door around 9 o'clock. She opened it, and he stood in the hallway looking like a man who also couldn't sleep. "He's going to do it," he said. "I think he's going to do it." "I don't know that." "The way he looked at those signature pages." He leaned against the door frame. That was the look of a man who recognized what he was seeing. "That's one way to read it." "What's the other way?" She thought about it honestly. That he's seen people bring him shaky evidence before, and he was calculating how much of it would hold. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "But you think it'll hold?" "I think the signatures are real," she said. "I think the payment records are real. I think 11 families sitting in a room and telling each other the same story. That's real. You can't fabricate that pattern by accident." She looked at him. "What I don't know is whether real is enough." He nodded slowly. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He pushed off the door frame to go. Then he stopped. "Abigail, whatever happens tomorrow, what you built back there, the kitchen, the supper, getting everyone in the same room." He looked at her steadily. "Nobody else was going to do that. Not me, not Grady, not any of us. We'd been right next to each other for years, and none of us thought to sit down together." He paused. "That was you." She didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She looked at him standing in the narrow hallway of a boarding house in a town that wasn't theirs, and she thought about flour sacks and cracked mirrors and bread ovens that nobody had used in 2 years. "Good night, Caleb," she said. "Good night." Ro issued the emergency injunction the next morning. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no speech, no pronouncement, no particular ceremony to it. He came in, sat down, reviewed his notes from the previous evening, asked Abigail 3 follow-up questions about the notary signatures and the timeline of the Grady payment dispute, and then told his clerk to prepare the order, freezing all land transfers and foreclosure proceedings associated with Cane Valley Land and Development pending a full investigation by the territorial court. He also issued a summons for R. Maddox and a separate order requesting Cane Valley's complete loan documentation portfolio for court review. When they stood up to leave, Ro looked at her over his glasses. "Who prepared these materials?" he said. "I did." He looked at her for a moment. "You have a legal background?" "No, I ran a boarding house and kept books." He made a sound that wasn't quite anything, put his glasses back in his pocket, and picked up the next file on his desk. They were dismissed. Outside on the courthouse steps, Caleb exhaled. "That's it?" he said. "That's all it—" "It's not all it is," she said. She was already moving toward the horses. "This is a freeze. It means nobody loses their land while the investigation proceeds. It doesn't mean Cane is done. It doesn't mean the loans are void, and it doesn't mean this is over." She untied Ruth from the post. "But nobody loses their land. That's what matters right now." He untied his own horse and swung up. "How long does an investigation take?" "Months, maybe longer." She settled into the saddle. "But a man running a scheme like this doesn't operate well under investigation. Every document becomes a liability. Every person who knows anything becomes a risk." She looked at him. Cane built this on secrecy and on people not talking to each other. Both of those things are gone now. They rode out of Hatcher in the early afternoon, back the way they'd come, and the road felt different somehow. Not shorter, not easier, but more purposeful, the way a road feels when you know what you're riding back to. Cane came to the saloon on a Thursday. She'd known he would. She'd told Caleb he would, and she'd been ready for it. But she'd been ready in the abstract, and it was different in the specific. Different to look up from the bar ledger and see the man himself come through the door. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd built a picture of him in her mind from the loan documents and the names people said in hard voices, and the picture had been of someone with obvious menace, someone whose appearance matched the weight of what he'd done. But Victor Cane was simply a well-dressed man of about 55, silver at the temples. with the easy proprietary manner of someone who has spent decades walking into rooms that rearranged themselves around him. He was accompanied by two men, Maddox, who she recognized from the description she'd gathered, and a younger man she didn't know who stayed near the door. Kane looked around the saloon with the expression of a man taking inventory. The room was half full for the mid-morning hour. Cowboys, a few townspeople, Reyes from the livery having coffee with his brother-in-law. All of them registered Kane's entrance in the way people register something that changes the quality of a room. Caleb was behind the bar. She watched him. She told him what to do. Stand there, don't give him the room. And she saw him make that decision in real time. The slight settling of his weight, the hands coming to rest flat on the bar top. He didn't smile. He didn't tense. He just stood there and looked at Kane coming toward him. "Caleb," Kane said, in the warm, easy tone of a man who presumes his welcome. "Good to see you. The place looks better than the last time I was in." "Victor," Caleb said, not hostile even. Kane's eyes moved across the bar, took in the room, landed briefly on Abigail, and moved on in the way a man's eyes move when he's decided in advance that something isn't worth his attention. Then they came back to her. "This is the woman from the agency," he said. Not to her, to Caleb. "This is Abigail Mercer," Caleb said. Kane smiled at her. It was a practice smile, the kind that's assembled from pieces rather than coming from anywhere real. "I heard you've been quite the addition to Black Hollow, Miss Mercer." He said it the way people say things when they mean the opposite. She looked at him. "Mr. Kane, can I get you coffee?" He blinked, slightly thrown by the normality of it. Yes, actually. Thank you." She poured it. She set it in front of him on the bar and let him take it and drink it and feel, for a moment, the very ordinary disorientation of a man who came in expecting a confrontation and is being served coffee instead. He set the cup down. "I imagine you know why I'm here." "I imagine you want to talk about the court order," she said. "I do." His voice lost the warmth just slightly. "Not much. He was too practiced for much, but enough. I want Caleb to understand that this legal action is unnecessary, that whatever concerns have been raised, they can be resolved directly between neighbors without involving courts." "Which concerns specifically?" she said. He looked at her more directly now, recalibrating. "The suggestion that Cane Valley's loan practices have been in any way improper? The forged notary signatures," she said. "Is that one of the concerns you'd like to resolve directly?" The room was quiet. Not ostentatiously quiet. People were still drinking their coffee, still doing what they were doing. But the quality of attention in it had shifted, the way attention shifts when something real is happening. Kane set his cup down with a precise, controlled movement. "I don't know what you think you found." "The same signature," she said, "on documents dated 3 months apart, from 2 different counties, for a man who would have had to be in 2 places at once." She kept her voice pleasant, conversational. "We've submitted those documents to the territorial court, along with the payment records for the Grady loan, which show that the default claim was based on a calculation error that appears in Cane Valley's records, but not in Mr. Grady's." Kane looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. She'd been watching for it. The thing that happens when a man who's been moving pieces around a board for years suddenly sees that someone has been moving pieces too. "You're a boarding house cook," he said. He said it quietly, with a precision that was meant to land somewhere. It landed. She felt it. She'd be lying if she said otherwise. But she'd felt things land before. "I kept books," she said, "for 6 years. I know what a fraudulent payment record looks like, because I've kept enough honest ones to know the difference." She looked at him steadily. "The investigation will take time, Mr. Kane. Months," the judge said. "In that time, nobody in this valley loses their land. Nobody has served a foreclosure notice. And every document your company has ever filed in this territory is going to be reviewed by people who are very good at reading documents." Kane stood very still. Behind him, Maddox had a particular expression. Not the expression of a man who thinks his boss is going to win this. "You're going to regret making an enemy of me," Kane said. He said it quietly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it loud. Caleb spoke then. She hadn't expected it. She'd told him he didn't need to say much, but he spoke, and his voice was level and clear in the way of someone who has decided exactly what they mean. "You came into my place," Caleb said, "and you had a drink, and you smiled at me, and you were already planning to take everything I'd built. That was your choice." He looked at Cain directly, without heat, without performance. "You can leave now." Cain looked at Caleb. He looked at the room, the cowboys at their tables, Reyes and his brother-in-law, the townspeople who were not pretending anymore not to be watching. He looked at Abigail. He picked up his hat. He walked out. Maddox followed. The young man by the door followed last. The room let out a collective breath that nobody admitted to. Reyes, from his table by the window, picked up his coffee cup and tilted it very slightly in Caleb's direction. Caleb nodded back. That was all. Cheb. The investigation took 4 months. They were not easy months. Cain did not disappear. Men like that don't disappear. They regroup and they probe for weaknesses, and they send lawyers to file counter-motions, and they spread rumors in the county seat about the reliability of the witnesses and the character of the woman who'd brought the case. There was a period in the second month when one of the families, the Fowlers, not the strongest link in the chain, wavered, and Abigail rode out to see them twice and sat at their table and went through the documents with them again, not with urgency, just with patience, until they steadied. There was a week when Caleb got a letter from Cain's lawyers threatening a defamation suit, and he brought it to her in the kitchen and stood there with it, and she read it and told him it was a pressure tactic with no real legal foundation, and he should not lose sleep over it. And then he asked her if she was sure, and she said she was sure, and then he said he trusted her and went back to the bar, and neither of them said anything about what it meant that he'd said that. Eli, during those months, had quietly become something more than an odd jobs boy sleeping in the tack room. Abigail had started teaching him, not formally, not with lessons announced as lessons, but in the way things get taught when one person knows something and another person is always there and genuinely wants to understand. He learned the accounts. He learned with some difficulty the basics of reading legal language, enough to ask the right questions, which was more useful than thinking you understood it all. He learned to make bread, badly at first and then better, and the day his first independent loaf came out of the stone oven with a proper crust, Abigail said nothing except "good" and handed him a knife to cut it with, which he understood was high praise. One evening she found him at the prep table again with paper and charcoal. He wasn't hiding it this time. He'd drawn the saloon full of people, the supper, she realized, from the arrangement of figures, in a way that caught something true about the evening, the leaning-in quality of people discovering they are not alone. She stood behind him and looked at it for a long time. "You should keep doing this," she said. He looked up at her. "Drawing?" "All of it. Drawing, learning the accounts, the bread. All of it." She looked at him. "A person should have more than one thing they're good at. Makes it harder for the world to knock you down to nothing." He looked at the drawing. "Are you going to stay?" he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered to him, directly, without making a performance of it. She sat down across the table from him. She'd been thinking about this for a while, not in an anxious way, but in the methodical way she thought about things that required honesty. "I came here to see if this place could be a home," she said. "I didn't know if it could be. I still don't know all of it." She looked at the drawing on the table, at the figures sitting close together. "But I think it might be." Eli looked at her. "Mr. Holt thinks so too," he said. "He doesn't say it, but he thinks a lot of things he doesn't say." She smiled at the table. "I've noticed." The territorial court's findings came on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, delivered by a rider who handed the papers to the clerk of the Black Hollow dry goods store because there was no official office in town, and the clerk sent Eli running to the saloon because Eli was fastest. Eli ran the length of the main street at full speed and came through the saloon door breathing hard and handed the papers to Abigail, who was at the bar with the morning ledger, and said, "They came." She opened them. She read them standing at the bar. The Cane Valley loan instruments had been ruled fraudulently prepared in 14 of the 22 cases reviewed across the territory. The notary forgery finding voided 8 contracts outright. The manufactured default against Walt Grady was overturned and the associated fees ordered returned. Victor Kane and R. Maddox had been referred to the territorial prosecutor for fraud and forgery charges, and a federal land office inquiry had been opened into the railroad corridor land acquisitions. The Brower family's east pasture, the one sold under the right of first refusal at loan value, was ordered returned, the transaction voided as unconscionable under the terms of the fraud finding. 11 families kept their land. She set the papers down on the bar and stood there for a moment. Eli was watching her face. "Is it good?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's good." He made a sound that was half laugh, half the release of something held too long, and then composed himself because he was 12 and considered himself too old for that kind of thing. Caleb came in from the back room, where he'd been doing something with the storage. He saw her face and the papers on the bar. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She went through it straightforwardly, the way she always went through things, and he listened without interrupting, and by the time she was done, he was leaning on the bar with both hands and looking at the papers with the expression of a man who has been braced for a long time and has just been told he can stop. He didn't say anything for a moment. She let him not say anything. "The Browers get their land back," he said finally. "Yes." He looked at the bar top. Margaret would have... He stopped. He'd been doing that less those months, not because she was less present to him, but because he'd found a way to carry her that didn't require stopping. "She would have liked you," he said. "She had no patience for injustice, none at all." Abigail looked at him. "She built a good oven," she said. The same thing she'd said the first week, but it meant something different now. Not just practical, but an acknowledgement of everything the oven represented. The woman who'd built it, the man who'd tended the space around it even when he couldn't tend much else. Caleb looked up from the bar. He looked at her, a direct, clear look, the wall all the way down. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not because you've been useful, not because the saloon is doing better." He paused, chose the next words with care. "Because this is where you belong, if you want it." He looked slightly uncomfortable with his own directness, which she found more convincing than smoothness would have been. "I'm not asking you to make a decision today. I know I didn't make things—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes. Yes, I'll stay." She looked at him. "I made that decision a while ago. I was waiting to see if you'd get around to asking." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh. The startled kind that comes out of somewhere genuine, and it changed his whole face. She realized she hadn't heard him laugh like that before. She thought she'd like to hear it again. Black Hollow changed in the way that small places change when something shifts in the center of them. Gradually, quietly, in ways you'd only notice if you'd seen the before. Holt's Saloon stopped being the kind of place you went to drink away a problem and became the kind of place you went to eat and sit with people and feel, for a few hours, like the world was manageable. That was Abigail's doing, and she wouldn't have argued with anyone who said so. But it was also Caleb's doing. The way he came out from behind the bar more. The way he knew people's names and used them. The way the closed, careful distance gradually became something more open. The empty building at the end of the street, Kane's would-be hotel, sitting boarded up for 2 years, was purchased at auction during the asset proceedings against Kane Valley, and the community collectively, awkwardly, incompletely discussed what to do with it. Walt Grady thought a meeting hall. Clara Dennison thought a school. Reyes thought a market. They argued about it in the saloon over several evenings, with considerably more noise than resolution, until Abigail suggested that a building could be more than one thing at different times of day, and everyone looked at her the way people look at someone who has said the obvious thing they'd been missing. It became all three, imperfectly. With a leaking roof they fixed twice and then accepted was just going to leak a little and put a bucket under. Eli Turner got a proper room in the boarding section of the saloon, not the tack room above the stable. He got it because Abigail simply stopped one evening and looked at that situation and decided it was wrong and said so, and Caleb agreed without argument. He ate at the kitchen table every morning and evening, and nobody called it anything formal because naming it might have made it strange. And it wasn't strange. It was just the way things were. He kept drawing. She kept teaching him the accounts. He learned fast and retained everything, which she recognized as the particular intelligence of someone who has learned to hold on to what he's given because he's had less than he needed. She thought about what he'd be someday if the world was something close to fair. She thought it often enough that she decided to do something about it rather than just think about it. She wrote a letter, several letters, to a school in Denver that took students from frontier territories. And she didn't tell him she'd written them until an answer came back, because she'd learned that telling someone you're trying to help them before you know if you can is just a way of making yourself feel better. The answer came back favorable. She told him on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen between the first and second loaves. He read the letter twice. Then he put it down on the prep table and looked at it. "That's far," he said. "Denver. Yes. I'd have to leave." "You would." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd manage without me?" She looked at him. "I'd manage," she said. "That's not the right question." He looked at the letter. "Is it paid for?" "Scholarship, based on the samples I sent them." She nodded at the drawings she'd gathered: the saloon supper, the bread oven, a sketch of Ruth the gray mare he'd done one afternoon. They were interested. He put his hand flat on the letter. He was 12 years old and had slept in a tack room for 2 years and had never expected anyone to write a letter on his behalf to anywhere. "I don't know what to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything yet," she said. "Think about it." He thought about it for 3 days and then told her yes. And she felt something she would have had trouble naming. Not pride exactly, because he'd done the work that made it possible, but something adjacent to it, something that had to do with seeing a person move toward what they were capable of rather than away from it. The courthouse steps were cold on the morning they went back to Hatcher for the final hearing, the one that formally closed the Cane Valley case and made the rulings permanent. 11 families attended, some with children, some without. Walt Grady stood with his hat in his hands and his 3 sons behind him. The Browers came with their son-in-law, who'd helped them work the land after they'd gotten the east pasture back. Clara Dennison stood beside Henry, whose arm she held in a way that looked like habit but was deliberate. They came out of the courthouse together in the late morning into the flat winter light and stood on the steps in a loose, irregular group. Not ceremonially, not posed, just the way people stand when they've been through something together and are now in the open air after. Caleb stood beside her. He didn't do anything dramatic. He just stood there close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Henry Dennison shook her hand. He shook it like he meant it. "My father built that land," he said, "and now my sons will have it." She nodded. Gerald Brower, who had struggled to sign the authorization letter and who had sat in this process for 4 months without fully letting himself believe it would resolve the way it did, came and stood in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She thought about what she could say back. She thought about the flour sack she'd stepped off that stagecoach with, and the first night in a kitchen that smelled of old ash and cold stone, and a man who dried a bowl he hadn't been asked to dry. She thought about a 12-year-old who ate bread with both hands and drew the truth of things with a piece of charcoal. "Take care of the land," she said. Gerald Brower nodded once, deeply, and stepped back. On the walk down the courthouse steps, Caleb's hand found hers. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. He just reached over and took her hand, the way you take someone's hand when you've decided they're yours and you're theirs, and you don't need to announce it. She let him. They walked down the steps together, and the rest of the group moved around them, and the cold air came off the flat land smelling like winter and distance and the particular cleanness of things after they've been resolved. She'd arrived in Black Hollow with a flour sack and a wooden box and a ledger with empty pages. She'd arrived at a place where her value was supposed to be visible the moment she stepped off a coach, legible in her face and her figure and whatever image someone else had assembled of what a woman should look like to be worth keeping. That was the calculation that had always been used against her, and against people like her. The idea that worth is immediately apparent, that what you see when you look at someone in the first 10 seconds is what they are and will be. It was a useful idea for people who benefited from it. It kept things efficient. It kept things simple. It kept people like Victor Kane believing they could read a room and know exactly what everyone in it was capable of and incapable of. It kept men like Caleb Holt from seeing, until someone made them look, what had walked into their kitchen. She had never been simple. She had never been immediately apparent, She had come from hard years and honest work and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself as strength because it doesn't need to. It just continues. And she had learned across those months in Black Hollow that a community is not a fixed thing. It's not a thing you find or fail to find. It's a thing that exists in the particular moments when people are in the same room and being honest about the same reality and choosing to face it together rather than separately. She had built that room. She'd done it with bread and ledger books and a willingness to wait in a judge's office until the right door opened. She'd done it imperfectly, with missteps and wrong assumptions, and people who wavered and a roof that still leaked a little. That was all right. The best things were like that, built by people who weren't perfect, in places that weren't ready, towards something they could only half see from where they stood. The horses were tied at the post at the end of the street. Ruth the gray mare looked at her with the same expression she always looked at her with, which communicated no particular emotion but a steady, reliable presence. Abigail put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. Caleb was already mounted. He looked at her across the small distance between the horses. "Ready?" he said. She looked down the road, south and west, back through the flat winter land, back toward the valley and the ridge and the main street of a small town where a bread oven was waiting. "Let's go home," she said, and they rode.